If you read the thumbnail text, you might think I am exaggerating. I mean, best operating system ever are some pretty big words, yet I believe they ring true for me. So true, in fact, that I think NixOS, the subject of today's video, will be my Linux home for a very long time, but it's possibly not suited for everybody. I'm Oscar, the super user, and this is going to be a very weird video indeed, because I'm going to sing the praises of NixOS and then tell you that maybe you should forget about it. So I think we should leave that part for the end and talk about NixOS is very different. How different, you might ask? Well, as different as a sudo password prompt and your confidence 5 seconds earlier. We've covered some very different distros on this channel, from stable and corporate systems like Ubuntu to DIY community-oriented ones such as Arch. But NixOS shatters all your perceptions of how a Linux distribution works. A comparison I've been thinking about is, if Linux is like a video game, well, Arch Linux would be like the lore canon final boss of the main game. Gentoo would be like the expansion pack's main villain, and Linux from scratch would be the ultra-difficult community ROM hack. But NixOS is New Game Plus. You start the game again from the beginning, but everything is totally changed. What you've learned from your first playthrough will not carry you entirely through this new run, and that's mainly because NixOS is what we call a declarative operating system. While traditional operating systems such as Windows, Ubuntu, or Arch allow you to install software and configure options and services on demand, imperatively, NixOS encourages you to declare them beforehand, so it really favors you know what you want from the beginning rather than going along to explore. You can still do things imperatively if you want, but it's not intended for you to do that because you do miss out on a lot of advantages I'll talk about later. So you do this declaration in a config file that looks like this. Yes, I know, not very exciting. It's basically lines of code using the Nix language, and you specify everything your system needs here. In theory, you could open a text editor on another computer and write your whole NixOS system there. When you install NixOS, you can build your system using the config file, and everything ends up being set up just the way you specified. So what does this allow you to do? Reproducible and reliable. As long as you conserve that config file, you can replicate the exact same computer system on another device. If you want the exact same setup between your desktop and your laptop with the same apps and configurations, you can build the exact same system multiple times. If you have a perfected config file and say you buy a new computer, you'd be able to set up everything the way you like in a fraction that it takes you to reinstall any other operating system. Not only that, but every generation of your system, that is, every time you do a change in the config file and you rebuild the system again, a checkpoint or snapshot is saved. If you mess up your system because you wrote something conflictive, you can roll back to the previous generation so you're never left in the dust and then fix the config file. Also, the system has atomic generations. This means that every instance you generate of the computer is independent of the other. It's like doing tiny clones of your computer, and say you decide to install a program that wrecks your system for some reason, then it only affects that specific generation. Just choose another clone and it's like nothing has ever happened. Atomic generations aside, packages are also isolated from one another, which avoids conflicts with shared libraries and global states. You can pin packages to stay on a specific version or channel, and they'll stay static for as long as you need them to be. It's true you could do this with Arch's Pac-Man as well, but sooner or later your apps could break if the rest of the system updates and there is a mismatch with a package version which is a dependency of the pinned package. So Nixpkgs have a lot of the strengths of isolation of something like Flatpak or Snap, but with the advantages of native system integration. Packages galore. Another cool feature of NixOS is that it uses the Nix package manager. The Nix repository of software is one of the largest general-purpose software collections in the Linux world, hosting almost anything you might need. It even has more packages than the Arch user repository. I've found everything here, which makes installing packages a breeze because you don't need to import additional repositories or PPAs like in Ubuntu or Mint, and you don't need alternative software stores like FlatHub. You just stroll over to the NixOS package search online, look up the name of what you want, and it will tell you how to write it in your config file. You rebuild the system, and voila, package installed. Let me tell you that this is possibly the easiest distro to get DaVinci Resolve installed on because it's just a matter of writing it there in your config. Maybe add the OpenCL or ROCm components for AMD GPU support, and it flies. It is still fiddly, honestly, but compared to getting it to run on Ubuntu, Mint, Fedora, or even Arch, it is quite easy. A downside to this declarative system as well is that when you need a specific package that you forgot to put in your config file, it does mean that you have to go to the config file, write it, rebuild your system, and that is much slower than imperatively installing the package. But still, you will reach a point where you don't need more packages. It really is surprising to see how many applications are available here, and they are natively installed and integrate seamlessly with the system. Another cool feature is that you can enable modules. These allow you to install packages, but with predefined options you would normally want. Say you want to have the GNOME desktop environment. Normally this is a huge meta package with many variables because you also want the GDM login service, you want basic GNOME apps such as Calculator, the Nautilus File Explorer. Well, with 2 lines of Nix code, you can enable all that without much thought or room for error. And if you want to switch over to KDE Plasma, just add an octothorpe, yeah, we're calling it the fancy way, in front of the GNOME lines and add the KDE Plasma options, and you can switch between desktop environments without any consequence. How cool is that? I've been using it to test DEs in a matter of seconds without wrecking my system or fixing and cleaning leftover dependencies. It's beautiful. Another great thing of this atomization is that on a system like Ubuntu or Arch, where the updates are incremental and depend on the current system state, it can lead to breakages. But on Nix, each update is built from the ground up, making sure it has everything it needs. On Arch, you had to make sure to update at least once every month, so the system always has a fairly recent anchor point. But with NixOS, you can have your computer frozen in time and then decide to update at a later time, and it should build up fine. So essentially, you could treat it like a LTS distro and never update as long as your machine works, or use it as a rolling release Arch-like distro, updating every day. It's quite mind-blowing. There's always a downside. Now, despite how cool NixOS sounds on paper, in practice, it does demand a lot of your initial time learning. Yes, I know I might say that a lot about Linux in general, but as I mentioned a few minutes ago, NixOS is a totally different beast to any other operating system I've seen. So many things you assume work on other Linux distros just won't work here. Take, for example, running an app image. They often don't work unless you enable the app image module. You might want to install Flatpak and enable the FlatHub repository, but you don't do that with commands. You have to enable the modules in your config file. As said before, you can do this imperatively through the command line as well, like a traditional distro, but you're going to miss out on all the Nix store atomization benefits that I mentioned before. And, the purpose of this distro is actually to use it declaratively. So all of this means that you need specific tutorials and guidance on how to get the things you want on NixOS, because traditional advice isn't that helpful. NixOS does have a wiki, and it's decent at best, but not as great, complete, or clear as the Arch wiki. I found most help by using Perplexity to search the web for solutions to common problems. Aside from the mentality shift, you also have the added difficulty of learning how to write the config file because, as I mentioned before, it is not plain language. It is using a programming language called Nix. So you have to get used to programming basics, and pardon my lack of technical precision here, things such as brackets, squiggly brackets, and using octothorpes to comment stuff, and also my biggest pet peeve, which is making sure that all your lines are properly enclosed. Those are all things that you have to learn. Luckily, NixOS does tell you when you've written something wrong, so the system fails to build in that case, and you can go see where the mistake is. But sometimes I've spent a few hours checking where the hell I missed a bracket. Why this is perfect for me. So many of you have already jumped off board when I mentioned you need to learn a specific computer language, but why then do I love it? Simply because once you get over the initial hump of learning how different it is, it's the most stable, serviceable, and functional operating system I have ever used. Like, after investing time on my config files, I hardly have to do any changes to them because I have the system I want for daily use, and I know that if everything works today, it will continue to work in the same way tomorrow. I also know that any mess up, which is hard to do by the way, can be fixed with a previous generation, so I never have an unusable computer. It is possibly the perfect Linux distro, at least for me. Now, I'm going to be finishing this video now, but I still haven't touched upon the topic of flakes, which is its own sub-area of Nix knowledge, but I'll get around to that quite soon. But overall, NixOS isn't for most people because of the reasons described, and that's why I can't really issue a broad recommendation because it demands a lot of upfront study. But if you have some free time, you're interested in its advantages, it pays off because I believe I don't want to switch to another distro ever again. And I know these words can change with time, of course, but right now, I've never been so convinced about an operating system as of right now with NixOS. It's God mode. I hope you enjoyed my enthusiastic take on NixOS, and at least I showed you something real cool, even if you might not ever use it. But regardless of the distro you have, you must always remember that with great power comes great responsibility.